Greetings.
Part 10, Night by the Fire. The marsh announced itself the way significant things announced themselves. Gradually, through accumulation, the world changing in small increments that individually seemed unremarkable and collectively constituted a complete transformation. The humidity came first. Not the assertive heat of the barrens, which had pressed against the skin, with the focused enthusiasm of something that had developed genuine commitment to the project. This was softer and more pervasive, a moisture in the air that was less about temperature than about the simple fact of a place where water was not an occasional visitor, but a permanent condition. Then the smell layered in a way the other environments had not been layered, growth and decay operating simultaneously rather than in sequence, the distance between alive and dead, and alive again, shorter here than anywhere he had walked. It was not unpleasant. It was specific, the way all honest things were specific. Then the green, committed and total, occupying every available surface with the focused intensity of growth that had no real competition, because it was the competition. The paths required a recalibration of every assumption the previous terrain had built. Things that looked solid were not solid, surface vegetation over soft ground that accepted weight and then declined to support it. Things that looked shallow carried a depth their appearance did not announce. He learned the marsh's signal vocabulary the way he learned all new vocabularies, through sustained attention and the willingness to be wrong about individual readings without overcorrecting into excessive caution, which was its own kind of error here. Etshaki adapted the way he always adapted, not concealing himself, which would have been both futile and contrary to his nature, but moving through the marsh's geometry in ways that limited the duration of his visibility without compromising his attention to the terrain. The gold eyes, Can thought, were better suited to the marsh than to any environment before it. So much of what mattered here lived below the surface, and Etshaki had never developed the habit of assuming he already knew what he was looking at. He had come to Dustwallow for the dragonkin and for the dragonscale they carried. The marsh's southern reaches, the region locals called the Wyrmbog, where the black dragonflight had settled in numbers enough to earn the place its name, held dragonspawn and young drakes in territories with the settled permanence of things that had no intention of renegotiating their tenure. They were dangerous in the way of things substantially more powerful than the ground they occupied, and farming their scale required the full application of everything the road had given him. Dragonscale was a different category of material from anything Harana's instruction in Faralas had fully prepared him for in its specifics, though the principles transferred, negotiating with a material that had its own structural integrity rather than imposing a shape onto something that accepted shaping. He improvised tools from what was available, worked from first principles when the ordinary leatherworking techniques failed against the new material, and accepted that the dragonscale's expense, difficult to acquire, easy to ruin, gave his mistakes appropriate weight. The marsh dragonspawn were not the forest predators Faralas had given him. They were ambush hunters here, the standing water and the dense reed cover changing the entire geometry of how an engagement unfolded, and he learned this the way the road always taught him things, by encountering it directly. On a morning when the mist sat low over a stretch of black water, he had been tracking a dragonspawn through for the better part of an hour. He had lost the visual trail twice already in the reeds, relying instead on the disturbance pattern the creature's passage left in the still water. A wake that dissipated faster than a wake in open water should, the marsh's algae and surface growth closing back over the disturbance within moments, so that reading the trail required reading something that was actively erasing itself as he read it. The dragonspawn came up out of the water, directly beneath where Etshaki had been standing a half-second before, the white lion already moving, not in response to the attack but ahead of it, having read something in the water's behavior that Can's own attention had not yet resolved into a clear warning. The creature's emergence through a wall of black water and disturbed reed matter that obscured the engagement's opening seconds entirely, and Can fired the first shot by sound and the memory of where the creature's mass had been rather than by clear sight of where it currently was. The footing was the genuine problem. Every step in the standing water was a question rather than a certainty, the marsh floor beneath the black surface uneven and treacherous, in ways that the open ground of Faralas or the barrens had never required him to account for. and he fought the dragonspawn with the awareness that a wrong step could cost him his stability at the exact moment it mattered most. He used the staff more than the axe in this engagement. The longer reach let him manage distance without committing his footing to ground he had not yet confirmed, and the staff's sweeping arc cleared the water's surface in a way that gave him information about what was beneath it that his eyes, blocked by the mist and the disturbed water, could not provide directly. Etshaki fought low, the white body moving through the shallows with a precision that minimized the surface disturbance his own movement created, reading the dragonspawn's positioning through the waters, behavior the same way he read open ground. The gold eyes finding what the water concealed before the concealment had fully resolved into visible threat. The engagement ended when Kan found the gap beneath the foreleg that Harana's anatomical instruction, given for an entirely different forest creature, but built on principles that transferred across most dragonkin, told him would be there. He stood afterward in water to his knees, breathing hard, the mist beginning to lift with the morning's advancing heat, and understood that the marsh had just taught him something the previous environments had not, that some of his most reliable instincts, built on solid ground, required active revision rather than simple application when the ground itself could not be trusted. He processed the scale that evening with particular care, the lesson of the morning still present in his hands. He brought his finished pieces to Brackenwall Village, on the marsh's northwestern edge. Brackenwall was not what he had expected from a horde outpost. It was an ogre village first and a horde settlement second, a scattering of huts and an ogre mound at its centre, run by an enormous and watchful figure named Tharg who had inherited leadership after Mokmorok, and populated mostly by ogres of the Stonewall clan, with a scattering of orcs, trolls, and a single blood elf vendor, who seemed to regard his own presence there with some private amusement. The smell of the place was different from any settlement Kan had occupied, wood smoke and crude metalwork, and the particular heaviness of ogre cooking. The huts built to ogre proportions in ways that made Kan, sizable as he was among his own people, feel oddly undersized. He sold to Crack, the village armourer, an ogre whose hands dwarfed even Kan's own, and who examined the dragonscale pieces with a directness that bypassed any pretense of negotiation. Good, Crack said, turning the piece in hands that seemed too large for the delicacy the assessment required. He paused. You, make more. It was not eloquent. It was, Kan understood, entirely honest, and honest was the only thing he required from an assessment. The silver Crack paid went where the silver always went, into the continuing accumulation of capability that Kan tracked not by the numbers themselves, but by what the numbers enabled. He stayed at the village fire several evenings during his time in the marsh, not because Brackenwall had particularly invited him to linger, but because Tharg, once he had taken Kan's measure across a few exchanges, seemed content to let him stay, and offered the unhurried company of someone who did not feel obligated to fill silence with talk for its own sake. On the third evening, Tharg told him, without much preamble, the shape of how Brackenwall had come to exist. We did not live here first, he said, his voice carrying the low rumble that seemed to be the baseline register of all ogre speech Kan had encountered. There was a village south of here. Stonewall Village. Built properly, in our own way, in a place we had chosen rather than a place we had ended up in. He looked at the fire for a long moment. The black dragonflight came for it. Not all at once. Patient the way dragons are patient, the way they take territory the way water takes ground, slowly, then suddenly all at once when you are not looking at the right moment. He was quiet, and Kan did not fill the silence, understanding that Tharg was not finished, and was simply taking the time the telling required. We lost the village, Tharg said. We did not lose ourselves. He looked at Kan directly. There is a difference. You walk with a white lion who I think understands that difference also, from the look of him. Kan said he does. Tharg nodded slowly. We came north, he said. Rexar led us once before my time leading now. He fought our old chief and won, and the winning earned him the leading, which is how it is supposed to work among the Stonewall, though it does not always work that way everywhere. He built what alliance we have with the rest of the Horde. We kept it after he moved on to other roads. Kan thought of the cliff at Shadowpree, the quiet half-ogre with the bear. The road does not end, said as terrain information. He said, I have met him. In Dessalis. Tharg looked at him with new and genuine interest. He looked at Can for a long moment, something in him quietly revising. Then he is the reason you are sitting at this fire and being told this story instead of being asked to leave it, he said. We do not tell this to many outsiders. He looked at the fire. We do not choose the dragons, he said again, the phrase apparently a fixed point in how he had organized his own understanding of what had happened to his people. We choose to keep living after the dragons choose for us. You take their scale from the bog south of here. Good. Less for them. More for us, eventually, one way or another. Can held this with the same care he held most things the road handed him, without a clean place to set them down. The dragonscale work, suddenly carrying a weight it had not carried that morning. The harvesting of something that had displaced the very people who now bought what the harvesting produced. He had heard from the same travelling fisherman in Shadowpree who had first spoken Nat Pagel's name, that the famous fisherman kept to the southern marsh, in the quiet water the locals called Tidefury Cove. He had not gone looking specifically. The dragonscale work and the marsh's other demands had filled his days. But on a morning when he had followed a channel south simply because it was a channel he had not yet read, he came around a bend and found a small dock extending into the water, and a single figure seated at its end with a line in the current. He understood, before he had any other confirmation, that this was the man whose reputation had reached him second-hand twice now, in Shadowpree from a stranger, and again here in the marsh from a Brackenwall fisherman who had mentioned the name with the specific reverence that genuine mastery produced in people who recognized it without necessarily possessing it themselves. Nat Pagel did not look up immediately. He was a human of indeterminate middle age, weathered in the unhurried way of someone who had spent decades doing one thing with complete attention, his line held with the loose precision of a hand that had long since stopped needing to think about what it was doing. You're the Tauren with the white lion, he said eventually, still watching his line. Word travels on water faster than it travels on roads. People underestimate that. Can said, I did not know I had a reputation yet. You have a small one, Nat said. Growing. He glanced over, finally, taking an etchaki with an assessment that was professional rather than alarmed, the look of someone who had seen enough of the world's stranger creatures from this dock, that a white lion registered as interesting rather than threatening. That's a serious animal, he said. You don't see that kind of calm in something that sighs unless it chose to be calm. Most things that sighs are calm because nothing's tested them yet. He has been tested, Can said. Nat nodded slowly, the way a man nods at information that confirms something he already suspected. He looked back at his line. You fish, he said. Not a question, Can understood by now that very few of the things experienced people said to him on this road were actually questions. Since before I could name what a river was, Can said. Nat was quiet for a while, and Can understood the quiet was not dismissal, but consideration. The patience of a man whose entire relationship with the world ran through water and was therefore unhurried by nature. Then he said, I hear things about fish that pass through interesting hands. He did not elaborate immediately, letting the line do its work, and after a long moment a fish took it with a decisiveness that made the conversation pause entirely while he brought it in. A practiced, economical motion that told Can more about the man's skill than any words could have. When the fish was secured, he looked at Can again, properly this time. There's a kind of fishing that's just fishing, he said, and there's a kind that becomes something else if you stay with it long enough and pay it the attention it deserves. He paused. I don't say this to many people. I'm saying it to you because the lion tells me something about what kind of attention you're capable of, and I've learned to trust what the animals around a person tell me about the person. Can listened with the full attention he gave things worth understanding. Then he said, I set people a task sometimes. Not often. He was still watching his line. 4 fish. The Sartharis striker, off the strand north of Shadowpree on the Dessalis coast. The Feralas ahi, which is a river fish whatever anyone tells you about the coast. The Misty Reed Mahai Mahai, out of the Misty Reed strand in the Swamp of Sorrows, which is a long way east of here and not a pleasant place to stand in. And the Savage Coast Blue Sailfin off Stranglethorn. Can waited for the rest of it. There is no rest of it, Nat said, reading the waiting accurately. That is the whole of what I will tell you. 4 fish and 4 waters. Where in those waters and when and how, that is the task. If I gave you the rest, you would catch 4 fish and learn nothing, and I would have wasted a good afternoon. Can said, and if I bring them, then we will have something to talk about, Nat said. He glanced over. There's a kind of fishing that's just fishing, and there's the other kind. What I give is for people who have come to the other kind. You haven't yet. He looked back at his line. But I don't think you're far, and 4 waters is a reasonable distance in which to find out. Can said, thank you for telling me that instead of nothing. Nat made a sound somewhere between a grunt and a laugh, the kind a man makes when he's pleased and doesn't see the need to show it. Go on, he said. Your lion's getting restless watching me catch things he's not allowed to eat. Can left him to his water, carrying the exchange forward the way unfinished things travel with you, not yet useful, just true, and waiting for the moment that will make sense of it. He found the reed beds on the marsh's eastern edge on his 4th day, where Dustwallow met the coast, the reeds dense and tall, the water carrying the brackish taste of fresh marsh meeting the sea's salt influence, the light arriving at an angle the interior did not produce. He fished it most mornings after that, and it taught him the thing brackish water always taught, which was that the rules of neither parent water applied cleanly, and the fish here had organized their lives around the disagreement. He took what the pot needed and returned the rest, and added the strand to the accumulating vocabulary, and did not think about it as preparation for anything, because it was not. It was simply the water in front of him, and he had never in his life been able to leave water in front of him unread. The dragonkin injury happened in the 3rd week, in the same southern reaches where he had learned the marsh's particular treachery underfoot. He had been working a stretch of the Wyrmbog, where the dragonspawn concentration ran higher, the mist thicker than usual that morning, visibility reduced in the way that changed the geometry of engagement, with things that moved quickly through dense cover. A smaller dragonspawn got past his and Etchaki's combined coverage, not through any failure of the coordination they had built, but through the simple mathematics of a creature using the water the way the first one had used it, low and concealed until the distance had collapsed too far for full correction, and left a significant gash along his right forearm before he turned the engagement back in his own favor. He treated it himself that evening with the sequence his mother had given him before he could have named why. The sequence Pan's stonebinder had formalized, and his hands now carried below conscious direction. The marsh was particularly unforgiving about contaminated wounds. The same biological intensity that gave the place its smell made untreated injuries here a different category of risk than the same injury anywhere drier. He cleaned it thoroughly, applied what he carried, bound it with the cloth his mother had insisted he take more of than he thought he needed. He noted, doing this, the gaps in his preparation that Dustwallow's conditions revealed: marsh fever, the particular exhaustion of sustained high humidity, wound contamination risks that drier climates simply did not produce in the same way. Pan had told him there would be situations exceeding his preparation, and had told him to know that and plan for it. He was knowing it now specifically, and planning for it the only way available to him in the field, doing what he could do correctly, and being honest about what remained beyond him. He found her at dusk, the first night elf he had ever seen, and the most beautiful thing he had ever looked at, on a day when the marsh mist was rising early from water that had been holding the day's warmth and was now releasing it. He smelled the blood before he heard her. A small sound, not a cry, the noise of someone who had been managing pain alone long enough that the management had become unconscious, escaping not because she had decided to make it, but because her body had finally exceeded what the managing could absorb. She was in a shallow depression east of the path, a night elf woman reduced by the position bodies adopted when they had stopped managing a situation and were simply enduring it. The leg was the obvious problem, wrong in the way that meant structural rather than soft tissue, unset and unsplinted long enough that the surrounding swelling had made the original injury look worse than it had likely begun. She was conscious, barely, the kind of consciousness of someone approaching the threshold past, which the mind's presence would no longer be sufficient for what the body required. She heard him approach, the eyes finding him, the large black tauren moving through the mist, the white lion visible behind him, and he watched the sequence cross her face. Alarm assessment, the recognition that alarm was not the most useful response available given what she was actually looking at. He crouched and opened his hands, palms up. She looked at his hands, at his face, at Etchaki sitting 3 feet to the left with the gold eyes on her, and the white coat carrying the mist in a way that was somehow not alarming at all. She said something in a language he did not have. The tone was a question, not a threat. He could not answer it in words. He gave her the next available thing, beginning the work immediately, with enough visible competence that the work itself would have to serve as the answer. The break was a clean fracture of the lower leg, bad enough that in the marsh at dusk it was a different category of problem than the same injury anywhere with access to a healer. Pan Stonebinder had drilled him on exactly this, the improvised splint, the sequence that turned a potentially fatal field injury into something that could survive until proper care. He had known the technique was sound because Pand was reliable. He knew it differently now from the inside, the actual application to an actual body in actual distress. He worked with the calm Pand had identified in him, the calm that was not the absence of understanding the stakes, but the presence of something steady alongside that understanding. He talked while he worked, not because she understood the words, but because a calm and purposeful voice communicated across the language barrier, the same way open palms did. He splinted the break with wood chosen for straightness, and the cord Thotta had shown him could serve multiple purposes, and she made the sound of someone receiving both relief at correct alignment and the sharp pain of a bone being moved at all, and he continued, because stopping was not the correct response to that sound. He cleaned the secondary wounds with his own water rather than the marshes, addressed the bruising, treated the early signs of marsh exposure. By the time he finished, her breathing had steadied, her colour still wrong from blood loss, but the wrongness had shifted from deteriorating to stabilised and waiting. He built the fire. The marsh's wood was wet in the way all high-humidity wood was wet, and his fire-starting kit had been built for more cooperative conditions. He coaxed a flame through its necessary stages, with the patient attention to airflow and sequencing that meant the difference between a fire and a repeated failed attempt, and had something sustainable established before the light had fully gone. Elf watched him build it. Her consciousness had improved enough that she was reading rather than merely enduring, and he recognized in her watching the look of someone with knowledge in an area, observing someone else's competence in that same area. She was a healer. She was reading his healing. He let her read it. He had nothing to manage in what she saw, only the work itself, done with what he had been given and applied as completely as he knew how. He cooked for her, not a secondary consideration, but a genuine requirement, a body depleted by blood loss and exposure, needing particular things in particular proportions that ordinary field rations did not provide. He drew on everything Roke had given him in Camp Narek, Aska Mistrunna's buff principles from Thunder Bluff, Wulan's lessons in extracting maximum value from limited materials in Desolis, the iron-rich preparation for blood loss, the warmth-producing elements for exposure, a base gentle enough not to demand more than a stressed digestive system could manage, and a flavour designed to open an appetite that trauma had closed. The smell reached her before the food was ready. He watched her eyes focus, her breathing change in the small involuntary way hunger produced when it met something genuinely good. She ate carefully at first, then with the complete attention of someone for whom the food had become, rapidly, the entire content of the present moment. He watched this with the satisfaction of a craftsperson whose work had performed at the level he knew it was capable of, not pride exactly, but the quiet acknowledgement that the thing had been done correctly, and the correctness had produced what it was meant to produce. She said something quietly when she finished. He did not know the words. The tone needed no translation. He kept watch through the night, the marsh changing register as its diurnal populations went quiet and its nocturnal ones began. He monitored her at the intervals Pand had taught him, breathing, colour, temperature, and kept the fire at the balance the night required. The checks required him to look at her, and so he looked at her and discovered somewhere in the second or third of them that he had begun looking for reasons that had nothing to do with her breathing. He had no vocabulary for any of it. That was the first difficulty. Everything he knew how to describe, He could describe because he had seen 100 versions of it and had learned where this one sat among them. This hide against that hide, this stone against that stone. He had seen one night elf in his life, and she was lying in front of him, and so there was nothing to set her against, and his mind kept reaching for comparisons and coming back with things that were not close enough to use. Her skin was violet. Not the violet of anything he had seen alive. Closer to the colour, the eastern sky held for the few minutes after the sun had properly gone, when it was not yet dark and had stopped being blue, and it carried the firelight the way that sky carried the last of the light, from inside rather than off the surface. The blood loss had taken something out of it. He could see where the colour should have been by looking at where it still was, along the jaw and the backs of the hands. Her hair was silver white and very long, and had come loose from whatever had been holding it during however many days she had been alone out here, and lay across the ground and through the mud and the marsh grass without seeming to belong to any of it. There were marks on her face, 2 of them running from below the eyes out across the cheekbones, a deeper shade than the skin they were set into, and they had not been made by any injury. They were placed and matched each other and had the deliberateness of something that meant a specific thing to people who knew how to read it. He did not know how to read it. He looked at them for longer than the checks required and learned nothing from them except that she came from somewhere with its own long grammar. The ears were long and swept back and moved slightly while she slept, the way an animal's ears moved when the sleeping part of the mind kept working anyway, and he found this unexpectedly the most familiar thing about her. Her robe had been good before the marsh had got at it. Grey-white, heavy, worked at the collar, and the cuffs with a silver thread in a pattern of curves that he eventually resolved into the moon at different fullnesses, the same shape repeating at different stages of itself. It was torn from the fall and stiff with what had come out of the leg. Her staff lay where he had set it, within her reach rather than his, because that had seemed to him the correct place to put a stranger's weapon. It was pale wood, worn dark where a hand had held it for years, and the head of it carried the same moon shape in worked silver. There was a knife at her belt that she had not reached for at any point during the evening, which he had noticed at the time and had understood as a decision. And at her throat, on a cord, a silver medallion with a mark he did not recognize. He came back to the face and made himself be honest about what he was doing. She was the most beautiful living thing he had ever looked at. There was no useful argument against it and no reason to construct one. But he was aware, sitting across a fire from an injured stranger with her legs splintered and her blood on his hands, that beauty was not among the things he had any business taking from this, and that she had not consented to be looked at by anyone, having been unconscious for most of the looking. So he looked at her breathing, and her colour and the temperature of her hands at the intervals Pand had taught him. He did that and did not entirely succeed at it, and was honest with himself about the not entirely succeeding, and let the fire burn down and built it back up, and the night went on. Etshaki positioned himself on her other side, unprompted, his warmth and the fire's warmth creating a thermal pocket around her that the marsh night, indifferent to the needs of the injured, could not fully override. At some point in the middle hours she woke, not the alarmed waking of their first encounter but something slower, the consciousness rising in stages. She looked at the dark, at the fire, at Etshaki watching the marsh with his patient golden attention. Then she looked at Can, sitting across the fire from her with the gun across his knees in the position correct watches required. She watched him for a long while. He was aware of the watching the way he was aware of most genuine attention directed at him, the air changing, the weight of being seen rather than merely looked at, and he let it continue for the full duration it required, not hurrying to meet it, understanding that she was making an assessment rather than confirming one already made. He did not look at her immediately. He gave the watching the time it needed, and the marsh continued its night business around them, indifferent to the significance of what was happening between the two people at this fire, and the fire made its small sounds, and the dark held them both. Then he looked back. They regarded each other across the flame, with the directness available to two people who shared no language at all. Only the full presence of one person and another, unmediated by anything words might have softened, qualified, or complicated. He could not read her face with the fluency he might have read a Tauran face, the vocabulary of Kaldore expression being its own thing he had not yet learned. but certain things required no translation. The look of someone who had arrived at a decision and found, to her own evident relief, that the decision had not been difficult to reach. There was something between them that evening that neither of them named, and both of them were aware of. The firelight had moved across her face and across his. The marsh had made its sounds around them. Then she reached for her robe. It cost her something. He watched it cost her, the shift of weight onto the good hip, the pause while whatever the movement had disturbed in the leg finished disturbing it, the second attempt. He did not help. He did not know what she was going after, and a person going after something with that much determination was not, in his experience, a person who wanted hands. What she brought out was a scroll. Not a small thing, a proper roll of parchment wrapped in oiled cloth against the marsh, the kind of protection a person gives a document when the document is the reason for the journey. She held it a moment. Then she looked at it and then at him and said something. 3 or 4 words, spoken with an emphasis that came through entirely intact despite carrying no meaning whatsoever. She held it toward him. He did not take it immediately. He understood that he was being given something and did not understand what, and the not understanding mattered, because a thing handed over under these conditions could be a gift or a burden or an instruction, and he had no way at all to ask which. She did not lower her arms. She said the words again, slower, and did something else with her free hand, touched her own chest, and then made a small motion outward and away, the gesture of a thing being sent rather than a thing being kept. Then she pointed at the scroll and closed her fist around nothing, which he understood with reasonable confidence to mean hold. He took it. What went through her then was not subtle, and it was not the relief of someone who had been given something. It was the relief of someone who had put something down. He turned the oilcloth back and looked at it before he put it away, because a man ought to know the shape of what he has agreed to carry, even when the substance is close to him. The parchment was good, better than anything Camp Narek produced, thin and evenly worked and pale. The writing ran in long level lines from one margin to the other, flowing and hooked and entirely shut to him, and the lines were ruled, and down one side there were short entries set apart the way a tally is set apart from the thing it tallies. That was all he could take from it, and it was not nothing. Whatever this was, it was not a letter. Letters did not have columns. This was a record of something, kept by someone who meant it to be checked. He wrapped it in his own oilcloth and put it in the interior pocket where he kept the things that mattered, and she watched him do it, and something in her shoulders let go that had been holding since before he found her. He did not know what he was carrying. He would not know for a long time. He knew only that a woman who had spent the evening declining to make a sound, while he set a broken leg, had just spent more of what she had left on getting a roll of parchment out of her robe than she had spent on the leg, and had gone to sleep afterward like someone whose work was finished. Then she closed her eyes and returned to sleep, and he returned to watching the marsh, and the night continued its slow turning toward whatever the deep hours held. It was later, in perhaps the 3rd hour, that he noticed her hands moving near his bound forearm. She was not asleep. She had apparently identified the location of his own wound through the stiffness of his movements through the night, or through some other reading available to a healer's particular attention that he did not have the vocabulary to name. Her fingers traced patterns in the air above the binding, slow, deliberate, the focused care of someone working within severe limits and choosing the working anyway. He watched her do it without moving, without speaking, understanding that whatever this was required his stillness more than it required anything else he might offer. He felt it as warmth, not the fire's warmth, which surrounded them both without particularity, but something else entirely, directed at the wound site with a precision that radiant heat from a flame could never achieve. It moved into the forearm in a way that bypassed the skin's ordinary registration of temperature and arrived instead at something deeper. The sensation of attention given form and pressed gently against an injury that had not asked for healing and received it anyway. He did not move. He let her finish with the complete stillness of someone receiving something genuine, understanding that interrupting it, even with gratitude, even with acknowledgement, would have been its own kind of imposition on a working that was costing her more than she currently had to spend. When she finished, her hands lowered slowly, as if the lowering itself required the last of whatever the working had drawn from her, and her eyes closed, and she was asleep again within moments, the working having demanded an immediate price that sleep was the only available payment for. He sat in the marsh dark for a long while afterward with the warmth still present in his forearm, fading slowly rather than vanishing all at once, and thought about the shape of what had just passed between them. Two people with no shared language, conducting an entire exchange in the only currency available to either of them. Attention given, action taken, one person's wound noticed and addressed by someone who had less to give than she would have liked and gave it anyway, which was, he was beginning to understand, what genuine care nearly always turned out to be when you stripped away everything that was not the care itself. The morning came the way marsh mornings came, not the clean, direct arrival of open country, but a gradual brightening of the mist itself. She was better. Not well, the leg would be what it was for some time yet, but pointed in a different direction than the previous evening's trajectory had been pointing. She had managed to sit up on her own by the time he woke, looking at the marsh with the expression of someone reassessing a situation, and finding the reassessment more favourable than it had looked from inside the previous night. Then she went still and looked past him and did not look back for a while. The two dragonspawn lay at the clearing's northern edge where the reeds began, one of them a good deal further out than the other. The crocolisk was south and closer. A big one longer than Can was tall, the kind of animal that came up out of standing water without any of the sound such a mass ought to make. None of the three had been there when the light went. Can followed her look, registered what she was looking at, and went back to breaking down the fire. He had not thought about any of it since it happened. That was the accurate account of it, and he examined the accuracy briefly and let it stand. The marsh had sent things at the fire in the way marshes did when there was blood and cooking smell and something injured lying still, and he had dealt with each of them at the distance where dealing with them was uncomplicated, and had come back to the fire each time and checked her breathing and her colour and the temperature of her hands, and the night had continued. ASHWALLOW had taken the second dragon spawn, which was why it lay further out than the first. Can had cleaned the lion's muzzle at the water's edge sometime in the small hours, because the lion would otherwise have spent the morning cleaning it himself, and the sound would have carried. She looked at the crocolisk for a long time, then at the reed lines, then at ASHWALLOW, who was lying where he had lain all night, entirely unremarkable about himself. Then at Can's hands, and then at Can. He met the look and did not fill it with anything. There was nothing available to fill it with, no shared word, and nothing he would have said in Torah either, since the only true sentence was that things had come to the fire and had been turned away from it, and a person who had slept through that did not need it recited to her over the morning's embers. She said something, 6 or 7 words, spoken slowly, in the voice of someone assembling a sentence carefully, because the sentence was going to have to carry more than sentences usually carried. He did not understand a word of it. He inclined his head, the way he would have to any statement he believed was meant seriously, and went on packing the fire out, and she watched him do it, and something in the set of her shoulders had changed and did not change back. He made simpler food for the morning, the crisis having passed into something that required maintenance rather than rescue, and she ate without hesitation. He assessed the leg, the splint holding, the swelling beginning its resolution, no sign of the contamination the marsh made especially likely, and adjusted what needed adjusting. She watched his hands with the same practitioner's recognition as the night before, and said something when he finished that carried the same tone as her words after the meal, gratitude that required no translation. He had watched her take a single leaf of parchment from her robe, smaller than the scroll, and somehow preserved through everything, and write on it with a focused deliberateness that suggested she was choosing each word carefully. It did not take her long. Whatever she was writing was short. When she finished, she folded it once and looked at him for a long moment, then removed a medallion from around her neck. It was old silver worked into a design that spoke of family and long history, a piece that meant something beyond its material value. She had held both the folded leaf and the medallion toward him. He had taken them with the care they deserved. Once, while he was breaking down the fire, he saw her look at his pack, a short look, at the place where the scroll had gone, the kind of look a person gives a thing they are deciding something about. Then she looked away and did not look at it again. He registered it the way he registered everything he could not yet interpret, set it aside, and went on with the fire. The silver was cool against his chest, and then it was warm, the way worn things became warm. He did not know what the scroll said, and did not know what the folded leaf said either, both of them now in the interior pocket where he kept things that mattered, even when he could not say precisely why. Alongside his mother's leather map, and the first piece of dragonscale that had met his own standard. He would not know what either of them said for a long time. In the morning he carried her. The journey to the Wyrmbog sentry point took most of the morning. She was not a small person, and the terrain did not cooperate, and she was conscious for portions of it, managing the pain of the broken leg with the same discipline she had shown the night before. He moved carefully and watched the terrain ahead with the attention the risk demanded, reading for Alliance patrols the way he read for anything that could end the carrying badly, and adjusted his route twice to avoid exactly that. He set her down at the edge of the Wyrmbog approaches in a position where the guard's attention would find her quickly, visible, safe, sheltered from the worst of the marsh damp, close enough to be reached and far enough that his own presence would not be the first thing the guard's eyes found. He looked at her for a moment. She looked at him. Then she leaned forward and pressed her lips briefly to his cheek, drew back, and looked at him with the expression of someone who had done what needed doing and was at peace with having done it. He stood very still with the medallion and scroll in his hands as she turned, and began moving toward the Wyrmbog on her crutch. The tall figure carrying both the limitation of the injury and the particular determination of someone who had survived something significant and intended to keep surviving it. Then he walked back into the marsh without speaking, because there was nothing in either of their languages that would have said the right thing, and the silence said something better. He had gone perhaps 100 yards when he heard her voice behind him, not calling to him, but calling in the direction of the Wyrmbog, and then the sound of guards responding. He did not turn around. He stopped when the reeds had closed behind him and looked at the medallion properly for the first time. Her cord was a night elf's cord. It would not have gone over one horn, let alone the pair. He sat on the dry rise at the reed line and worked the silver free of it, and cut a length from the leather roll in his pack, and braided a cord of his own. The plain 3-strand braid his hands could execute without consulting him about it. It took less time than it deserved. He tested the length twice, adjusted it once and put it on, and let the silver drop beneath his shirt, where it settled cool against the skin and began, almost immediately, to stop being cool. Her cord he coiled and put in the interior pocket with the scroll. It was hers. That was reason enough. He did not know what the scroll said. She was a night elf priestess, alive because the marsh had produced a specific combination of circumstances, and a tauren hunter with a broken horn happened to be correctly positioned with the correct training and the correct attention. The days that followed had the register of days that knew something significant had occurred, and were being themselves in the context of that knowledge. He continued the dragonscale work, the mistakes becoming more precise, and therefore more instructive, the finished pieces beginning to carry the character that distinguished work made from genuine understanding from work made from applied technique alone. Harana had told him not to confuse progress with arrival. He was not confusing them, only noting that the progress was real, and that real progress deserved the acknowledgement of continuing the work that had produced it. Marsh fever found him for 3 days in the 4th week, and he managed it honestly, resting when resting was correct, eating what the condition required rather than what convenience offered, monitoring his own state with the same methodical care he gave everything external. By the 5th day he was back in the field. He went west in the 5th week. It was the wind riders that made it reasonable. 2 of the 4 waters were behind him, in country he had already walked and already read, and a year ago that would have meant months. It meant 9 days now. He put the dragonscale work down, told Tharg he would be back before the moon changed, and took the wyvern out of Brackenwall in the grey before dawn. Sartharis Strand was a long, pale curve of Desolis coast north of Shadowpree, the same grey country he remembered, the same sea underneath it. He had fished the deep water off the cliffs with Luimala and had never once come north to this strand, and standing on it, he understood why the striker held here and nowhere he had been. The shelf ran out shallow for a long way before it dropped, and the drop was where the cold water came up, and the whole length of the strand was one long edge between two temperatures. He read it for 2 days and fished it on the third and took the striker in the late afternoon, and it fought like something that had been using that edge its whole life. The striker went into salt before the light was gone, the way Wulan had taught him to put a thing into salt when the thing had to last, gutted and split along the spine and packed hard in it, the salt drawing the water out of the flesh over days and taking the flesh's willingness to rot along with it, then dried slow in shade rather than sun, then wrapped in oiled cloth and set where the pack's own weight would not press it out of shape. He understood something doing it that he had not understood catching it. Pagel had named 4 waters that lay a continent apart, and had said nothing whatever about how a fish gets from the fourth of them to a small island southwest of the Ramor. He had not needed to. A man setting that task to a fisherman was setting the whole of it, the reading and the taking and the keeping. And the keeping was the part that happened alone, over months, with nobody watching and no way to check the work until it was far too late to do it again. He salted the ahi 4 days later with the same care. After that he stopped thinking of them as fish he had caught and started thinking of them as fish he was still carrying. He was in Shadowpree that evening. Luimala was at the same water she was always at, and looked at him without surprise and asked what he had come back for. He told her. She said North Strand. Of course. Then she said nobody here fishes it. It is a walk and there is nothing there but the one thing. Can said there is nothing there but the one thing. She considered that for a moment, and then made a sound that might have been approval and went back to her line. The Ferala's river took him 4 more days. He had spent 6 weeks at Camp Mojash and had never followed the water inland, because the water had not been the reason he was there. The stream came down out of the high country and met another coming from the north, and where they met the channel widened and slowed and split around a spit of gravel into 2 pools. And it was obvious from the first morning that one of them was the pool a person fished, and the other was not. He read them for 5 mornings. The western pool was the accessible one, easy ground, easy casting, the water broad and open, and doing everything that water is supposed to do to make a fisherman feel welcome. He sat above it on the first 2 mornings and did not put a line in it. What he was watching was the current, which arrived in the western pool already spent from the widening and turned over slowly there in the sun, and went into the eastern pool narrow and fast and cold off the highland stream, still carrying what it had brought down from above. The light reached the 2 pools differently, and so did the insects. The eastern pool held its shade until well after the sun was up, and the small surface hatch there came late and stayed late, and on the 4th morning he watched a rise form in that shade that was not the rise form of anything small. He fished the eastern pool at dawn on the 5th day. The ahi took the line as the light came flat down the channel, and it was the strongest fish he had ever had on a line, and it took him a long time and most of what he knew. He held it a moment before he preserved it, the way he had held the first pike he had ever taken out of the river at Camp Narek, for the same reason which he could not have explained then either. Then he took the Wind Riders back east, and the marsh received him the way the marsh received everything without comment, exactly as wet as he had left it. The question of the road east resolved itself at the Brackenwall fire, the way most practical questions had resolved themselves on this road, sideways, through other people's knowledge, offered to someone who had demonstrated he knew how to listen. He asked about the road to Arathi Highlands, and an orc who worked the marsh's trade routes gave him the answer with the flatness of a man reporting weather. There is no road. Not the kind you walk. The Eastern Kingdoms sat across the Great Sea, and the sea offered exactly 2 doors. The goblin zeppelins out of Orgrimmar, weeks to the north, which crossed to the dead lands of Lord Iran far north of where he needed to be, and the Alliance ship out of the Ramor, half a day from this fire, which crossed to Menithil harbour at the wetland's western edge, 2 days' walk from the highlands. The orc laughed once without much humour in it. The short door is the closed one, he said. No horde walks that pier. It was an older orc woman at the same fire who changed the shape of the problem. She had been looking at Can's chest for some time before she spoke, and when she spoke it was to say, "Show me that." He lifted the medallion on its cord, and she turned it toward the firelight without taking it from him, and read the mark worked into the silver and said, "Moonwhisper." A priestess house. Old and known. She let the medallion rest back against him and looked at him with new information visibly rearranging old observations. The story had already crossed the marsh in both directions. She said the elf carried back from the edge of dying, the tauren who kept the fire, the white lion. Stories with a white lion in them travelled. If the priestess had reached the Ramor alive, then the Ramor had heard it told. She nodded at the medallion. A debt is a door, she said. And that kind pays its debts precisely, not warmly, but precisely, if only so it does not have to keep carrying them. He sat with it for a long time after the fire burned down, working the arithmetic the way he worked every serious risk. A tauren approaching an alliance fortress quietly was a threat, and threats were answered before questions were asked. A tauren approaching openly in daylight, weapons stowed, carrying a mark their own story already contained, that was a question. Questions got the chance to be answered. It was not a small risk. It was a readable one, and readable was what he required. From the thoughts of Can ASHWALLOW.
I carry a scroll I cannot read. This is its own kind of carrying, different from carrying what I understand, different even from carrying what I do not yet understand, but have a framework for eventually understanding. This is carrying something entirely inaccessible, sealed with a mark I do not recognize, given by someone whose name I learned only after she had gone. In a moment I understood as significant without being able to fully account for why. She wrote through the night's quieter hours, choosing each word with the care of someone who understood she would not be able to explain them afterward. The scroll is what the writing produced. I will carry it to Thunder Bluff, so an elder can read what I cannot. The medallion is silver and warm against my chest, and I do not remove it. Nat Pagel gave me 4 waters and no instructions, and I have been trying to decide whether that was generosity or a test, and I think it was neither. I think he simply told me the true amount. Anything more would have been him fishing those waters instead of me. He said there is a kind of fishing that becomes something else if you stay with it long enough and pay it the right attention. He said he does not tell many people this. I do not fully know yet what he meant. I am simply letting it sit, unhurried, the way most things on this road eventually explain themselves if I give them enough time. The eastern pool held its shade late, and the current came through it cold and unspent. The western one was easier in every way a man notices. I sat above the easy one for 2 mornings and did not put a line in it, and I could not have told you on the first morning why I was not fishing. Tharg said we did not choose the dragons. We chose to keep living after the dragons chose for us. I have been thinking about this since he said it, sitting at the Brackenwall fire surrounded by people whose home was taken from them, by the same dragonflight whose scale now pays for the silver in my pack. I do not have a clean way to settle this. I am simply letting it stay unsettled, the way some things on this road never quite resolve and don't need to. Moon Whisperer. I have a name now, learned after the fact, the way names sometimes arrive sideways, from someone who recognized a mark rather than from the person who wore it. A night elf priestess, alive because a marsh produced a particular combination of circumstances, and I happened to be correctly positioned with the right training and the right attention. I think about the man in Desolus, the boy in the Quilbur camp, the remains on the Thousand Needles crossing, the elf woman. The pattern is clear now, consistent orientation toward whoever needs what I have, across faction lines and language barriers, and all the ordinary reasons people give for not helping each other, none of which I have ever found sufficient. My mother said, a hunter who cannot care for himself becomes a burden to everything that depends on him. I understand now the other half of that instruction, the half she trusted me to find myself. The capability, once maintained, is not for its own sake. It is for what it enables. It enabled this, the night by the fire, the food that opened an appetite trauma had closed, hands that knew the sequence without requiring direction. I think of Tama sometimes in the marsh evenings, what she would have made of two people with no shared language finding ways to reach each other anyway. I think Tama would have found a way to ask her everything within an hour regardless of the absence of words, simply by refusing to accept that the absence mattered as much as everyone assumed it did. Arathi Highlands ahead. I think I am ready for it. The road continues north. Can ASHWALLOW.